So, Lone Rider here, and a while ago I did a video where I talked about illegal immigration, and basically you can't deal with the effects of a problem until you've stopped the problem from being an ongoing thing. And I just thought I'd explain my rationale for that, because I don't know, maybe I wasn't as clear, or maybe people aren't getting it, but the gist is we have two issues with illegal immigration. We have the problem of people coming here illegally, and then we have the result of that, which is that there are people in the country illegally. They're two things that are related, but they're different parts of the same problem. And I use the analogy of dealing with a flood because I think that's quite appropriate. Some time ago, my folks' house had a small flood in the basement. I don't know, it was a pipe or something that broke or whatever, but they were faced with the issue of what to do with it. And like most normal, mentally functioning people, they didn't decide to try and replace the water-damaged furnishings while the house was still flooding. They stopped the flooding. They replaced the pipe or water heater or whatever it was that was doing the damage. And then they assessed the damage and they began deciding, what they needed to replace. It would be, I don't think there's anybody out there who would say that if your house is flooding, the thing to do is rush out to IKEA and buy a new rug or a new carpet and then install it while the house is still flooding. Why? Because it's just going to get damaged again. You stop the flood, you deal with the actual cause of the problem, and then you can set about addressing the second thing, which is the effects of that, right? So if we were to make an analogy to the border, the flood is the people entering the country illegally overstaying visas, etc. Basically, the actual illegal immigration itself. If we are talking about what's the second part, what's the consequence of that, that's the population of people who are currently in the country illegally. And virtually every proposal that has been put forth on the subject of illegal immigration to try and address this, whether it's in favor of harsher enforcement or whether it's in favor of a pathway to citizenship and legalization or some compromise between the two, almost all of these proposals have to do with what to do about the legal status of the people who are here already. None of them seem to address the issue of what to do to keep people from coming in. And the problem is, it's like the analogy to the house that's flooding. If your house is flooding, you don't sit around talking about, hey, should we buy a new sofa or a new love seat or a new carpet or a new bookcase? Why? Because your house is still flooding. Anything you buy to replace what's been damaged to try and deal with the effects, essentially, is just going to be affected again because you haven't dealt with the actual ongoing problem, which is the fact that water is still pouring into your home. The irony is, I don't think that there's anybody out there that has a pair of functioning brain cells to rub together that would say that if the issue was a flood in your home, that you should try to deal with the consequences of the flood before you actually stop the flood from continuing. But somehow, when it's not your home, but it's your country, and in particular in terms of these politicians on both the left and the right, the country that they've been elected to represent and ultimately safeguard, they seem perfectly willing to literally put the cart before the horse and talk about what to do about the people who are already here before they've even addressed the issue of how to keep more from coming in. And of course, there's always the issue of, people will slip through the cracks. I mean, no matter what rules you have against anything, there's always some people who are going to break the rules. But the point is, when you have lax enforcement, when you have, in fact, some local and municipal and city policies, such as the sanctuary city policies, most famously, that essentially are at odds with, the rest of the law, and basically almost encourage and or protect people who break it, well then, you're going to, combined with lax enforcement generally, you're going to see a situation where people, the problem is going to continue. You're not dealing with the problem. And I actually don't know what the answer is in terms of dealing with it. I don't know if it's just more effective enforcement against people who are, here illegally. I don't know if it's some kind of a physical barrier to try and prevent more people from crossing. I don't know if it's maybe more strict penalties for people who, let's say, might hire folks that are here illegally, etc. I honestly don't know what the answer is. But the thing is, we do need to try and look for that answer before we even debate the issue of what to do about the people who are already here illegally. it's pointless to try and say we're going to have some big policy shift on how we treat people who are here illegally, whether it's legalizing them, whether it's deporting them, whether it's whatever, before we address the problem of preventing more from coming in. Why is that? Well, the issue of what to do about the people who are here is very contentious. There's a lot of people who don't like the idea of doing anything that would reward or encourage them. There's a lot of people at the same time who seem to believe that they should be, since they've been living here illegally for a long time and have ties to the community, that we should just overlook the fact that they've been doing so illegally. And these two sides and their various factions is very contentious. In order to get any kind of a compromise accomplished that would allow one side or the other to have what it wants, or on this issue one way or the other, the only way you're going to be able to sell it to the naysayers on either side is if you can convince them that this is a one-time thing, that you've solved the problem and that now you're just dealing basically with the leftovers, with the effects. Nobody is going to support, even people who might be palatable to the idea, nobody is going to support amnesty or anything close to it if they think they're going to be back here having the same discussion in 5 or 10 years, because you haven't done anything to stop more people from coming in illegally. Similarly, people who are against border enforcement, they might be persuaded to tolerate the deportation of some illegals, especially those who've done crimes or other dangerous things like driving illegally, but they're not going to be convinced to go along with that unless, again, you can convince them that it's going to be a one-time thing because we've solved the problem of more people coming in. So no matter which side you're on, you have to look at this and say, the issue of dealing with what to do with the people that are here currently is going to be a very contentious political hashing out. And the only way either side is going to gain any traction with the doubters on the other is if they can convince them that this is the last time you're going to have to do this, that it's not going to be something that it's not going to be a discussion we're going to have in another 5 years, right? Yeah, I'm asking you for this favor, but it's only one time. But there's no way to sell that as a believable thing when you haven't actually done anything to address the problem of people coming here illegally before having that discussion. And so the problem, it's not just a pragmatic problem, like, your house is flooding and you're going to just go out and buy a new carpet and throw it down over the old rotting one. Well, that's not going to help. That'll be water damage too pretty soon. You're just going to be back where you started because you haven't dealt with the problem. It's not just that it's a pragmatic issue of, you're not dealing with the problem practically. It's that politically, the only way to get anybody to agree to any kind of a deal on the issue is going to be if you can tell them that it's not going to be the first of many, many deals you're going to be asking them to make, but it's just this one time because you've solved the problem. And the issue for many people, I think, who don't like the idea of amnesty or legalization or pathway to citizenship or whatever that would be rewarding people who broke the law to come here. The problem is that everybody who has doubts about that or who is opposed to it can look back at numerous times in the past when we've had amnesties for illegal aliens, for example, and they were sold to the public as this is the one time we're doing it. But because nobody ever adequately dealt with the problem of people coming here illegally in large enough numbers that it was an issue. Again, people are always going to slip through the cracks, but the point is when you have essentially a, lax enforcement has become the de facto policy, that's very different than a handful of people slipping through the cracks, right? I mean, murder's against the law, but people still do murders. But the thing is, nobody does murders in large enough numbers that people are actually proposing to legalize the murders because it would be a logistical nightmare to prosecute them all. That essentially is what people are saying about some of the people being here illegally, that essentially there's so many of them, there's no way we could possibly, enforce the law against them all, so we have to have some kind of a compromise just from a practical standpoint. Of course, my question to that would be, how did there get to be so many that it got to that point? If what you're saying is true. And of course, the answer to that, the only answer, is that you didn't stop the problem when it was smaller. You didn't nip it in the bud. You didn't deal with it when it was only 5 million people. So now it's 10 or 12 or 11 or or 20 million, whatever the figure is. It's changed over the years since people really started talking about this seriously in the mid 1990s. Um, and I think it is telling that in the intervening 20 years, a lot of people have made speeches and poked holes in the air with their finger and grandstanded, but almost nobody's done anything to really try and solve the actual problem. And again, the problem isn't just the presence of people here illegally. The problem is, I mean, that's a problem, or I should say, it's an effect of the problem. And politically, it is a problem in terms of people have to figure out what to do about it. But the cause of that problem is that people are coming here illegally. If you don't deal with that and you don't try and cut off the flow, it's getting ahead of yourself to talk about what to do about the people who are already here, because you don't know how many more there's going to be. You don't know you're not going to be back here having the same discussion in 5 or 10 years. In other words, you haven't actually solved the problem. It's kind of funny. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he said, that makes sense, except you're overlooking one thing. And I said, what? And he says, well, a lot of these politicians don't want to solve the problem. They like having issues that they can use to grandstand and poke holes in the air with their finger and make political hay with. I thought about it, and, I mean, maybe that's the case for some of them. And if that's the case, that's pretty damn sad. But for those of us who are looking at this and saying, it doesn't help anybody to keep the status quo. It doesn't help, the rest of us. It doesn't help the country and the society as a whole to have this, large, unassimilated, illegal population. Doesn't help the, law enforcement that has to try and deal with it. It doesn't help, the communities in which these people live. It doesn't help the people themselves who are trapped in essentially sort of a legal limbo. And at the end of the day, the question is, do you want to make progress on this, or do you want to be still having this discussion in 5 or 10 or 20 years? And I don't think there's anybody, again, outside of maybe a handful of grandstanding politicians, if my cynical friend was right about that, who want to still be having this discussion in 5 or 10 or 20 years. I think we'd like to think that we've learned a thing or two over the last 20 years. But the problem is it doesn't seem like people have. And, I'm looking at it as, if you approach this not as some cause for signaling moral outrage and as an excuse to call your political opponents names or point fingers, if you just look at it as a problem that has to be solved, what do? Well, you deal with the cause, and then afterwards, you try and address and mitigate the results of the effects. The cause is the people are coming here illegally. The effects is that there are people then in the country illegally. But the problem is all the proposals on the books right now talk about what to do about the people who are here illegally right now. None of them say anything about cutting off the flow so that more of them don't come in. And when anybody does propose any kind of border enforcement or anything to try and reduce the flow, the issue immediately becomes polarized with name-calling and accusations of bigotry and this or that or the next thing. And it's like, okay, I understand politics is divisive, but if you really want to solve this problem, we have to be able to talk about it without screaming at each other. And I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening because I don't see anybody actually talking about the cause of the problem, which isn't, by the way, the fact that there are these dreamers or the DACA recipients or people who want amnesty or this or that or the next thing. That's all an effect of the fact that we've had illegal immigration ongoing in large numbers for many years. I mean, if we hadn't, these people wouldn't be here. But the thing is, that's the effect. And it's all well and good to talk about what to do about that and what we should do to try and deal with the situation that the country finds itself in and that those people find themselves in. It's all well and good to talk about that after we've solved the problem of people coming here illegally. To talk about it beforehand is kind of, well, it's as asinine as running out to IKEA and buying new home furnishings to replace the ones that are water damaged while your house is still flooding because you haven't shut off the leak. And I guess that was the point I was trying to make, that the problem is that there is a leak. The result of the problem is that there are people here illegally. We have to sort that out. But before we even get to that, we need to address the problem of the leak. And it's stupid and pointless and counterproductive and irrational and foolish and just not a bright thing to spend any effort talking about what to do about the people who are already here when we haven't shut off the access of illegal immigration and when we haven't stopped the flood, essentially. Because we don't know ultimately how many people are going to be here. We don't know ultimately what the parameters are of that issue, of that effect of the cause, because we haven't dealt with the cause. We haven't stopped it. It's still ongoing. And like I said, I don't have an answer. I don't know whether the solution is better, law enforcement, whether the solution is a physical obstruction, like a fence or a wall or, whatever. I don't have all of these answers. But I can understand conceptually how you go about solving a problem like this, because it's analogous to any other problem where you have a cause and an effect. And again, if you have a pipe break in your house and it starts a flood, you don't go out there and talk about what to do about the flood damage until you've stopped the flood and you even know the extent of the damage. And more importantly, that you know it's not going to be constantly increasing and continuing. And we aren't there yet, right? Any time we spend talking about DACA or talking about a pathway to citizenship or talking about amnesty by any other name or whatever, or even just talking about deporting all the people, anytime we spend talking about what to do about the people who are currently here illegally is wasted. Because what we need to do first is cut off the flow. Then we can have a discussion. We can talk until the cows come home about what to do about the people who are here illegally. But we haven't got to that point yet because we haven't even dealt with the problem which led them to be here in the first place. And the only reason I could think of for that is that, one, people are really stupid. They're the kind of people who literally would run out to IKEA and buy new home furnishings while their basement was still flooding to try and replace the old ones before shutting off the flow of the water. Or they're cynical politicians who are trying to exploit this for political gain and have no interest in solving the problem. And neither of those, I don't know about you. I prefer that the elected representatives of this country weren't either the village idiot and or incredibly cynical and exploitive of real problems that have real effects on people. Unfortunately, those are the only two options I can think of that explain this kind of foolishness. The fact that we're even talking about what to do about after we solve the problem, before we solve the problem. And anytime you hear anybody on TV or in the newspaper or whatever talking about what to do about the people who are here illegally, without first addressing the issue of how to stop more people from coming illegally, they either have no interest in solving the problem or they literally don't understand how you solve a problem. And my problem with that is, again, if this was something like their basement flooding, they would all pretty much know what to do. You stop the flow of the water, then you deal with the effects of it. So why is it when instead of the basement and house, it's their country, all of a sudden they lose their marbles and they don't understand basic things like this? And I don't have an answer to that either. Like I said, I have two possible suggestions. One is that they're not trying to solve the problem. They want to keep it around as a political wedge. And two, maybe they literally are just stupid. I don't know. I'd like to think neither of those is true for the majority of people, but you gotta wonder, right? I mean, and the ultimate irony, of course, is even bringing this up gets people to point fingers at you and call you names and, oh, you're mean, and you don't care that all these poor people are trying to get here and they're dying out in the desert and this and that. No, I feel bad for them, but I also understand that we as a society have to have, functioning society, which would include a government, which would include laws. And, if you don't like the border laws, change them. But, encouraging people to come here illegally is not an answer. And failing to address the problem, people coming here illegally with adequate enforcement or anything else that would deter it, is not an answer. And then sitting here trying to talk about, well, what to do about the effects of that before you've even addressed the cause, which is that they are coming here illegally, is not the answer. Again, we could reach some kind of extremely contentious political compromise, perhaps involving something like the current government shutdown and funding. It's what now, like day 13 of that. suppose they actually strike a deal, and they get some some of what the people who want to deal with the problem of illegal border crossing want, and the other people get some of what they want, and the government shutdown ends, and there's a compromise. If it doesn't actually deal with the problem, and it just nibbles around the edges, or it just talks about what to do about the people who are already here, we're going to be back here having another government shutdown and another debate in 5 or 10 years, because that's the whole point, is that you're not dealing with the problem. Again, if your house is flooding, you stop the flood before you try and address the damage. And I don't understand why people can't see that. Why people can't see. I mean, to me, I'm looking at this as any other simple problem that you would solve. Yes, there's a lot of peripheral side issues that are very emotional, that get people very worked up. But if you're looking at it the same way you look at, how do you change? What do you do about you have a flat tire on your car? What do you do if you have a problem with the mechanics on your bike? What do you do if you have a pipe leak in your home? You solve the problem, then you deal with the effects. This is no different, if you actually want to solve the problem. Now, if you just want to keep it around so that you have a political talking points and yada yada, then yeah, you just do what people have been doing for 20 years, which is nothing. But I don't know about you, something like this that has real life consequences for people, both the rest of us and the people who are here illegally, I would like to actually get down to the nitty gritty and solve the problem, rather than just sit here and poke holes in the air with my finger and make speeches. And it would be nice if some of the elected representatives of this country wanted to do the same thing. We didn't elect them to poke holes in the air with their finger. We elected them to actually solve problems like this. And, I mean, just a thought. Lone Rider out.